It was a quiet Saturday morning in the sleepy suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek when John Miller, a retired Navy SEAL, heard his wife, Emily, scream from their front yard. The sound cut through the calm like a knife, and what followed would unravel a chain of events that no one in the neighborhood could have anticipated. The local homeowners association, notorious for its overzealous enforcement of petty rules, had crossed a line they didn't know existed, one that would awaken the instincts of a man trained to protect, defend, and, if necessary, neutralize any threat. John Miller had lived a life most people could only imagine. 20 years in the Navy SEALs had taken him to the world's most dangerous corners, from covert operations in hostile territories to high-stakes rescues under fire. He'd seen things that haunted his dreams and done things he'd never speak of, not even to Emily, his wife of 15 years. When he retired 3 years ago, John chose Willow Creek for its promise of peace, a place where he and Emily could build a quiet life, free from the chaos of his past. The neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and cookie-cutter homes, seemed like the perfect place to blend in, to fade into the background. John wanted nothing more than to leave his old life behind, to be a husband, a neighbor, maybe even a father someday. But the HOA had other plans. The trouble started 6 months ago, when John and Emily moved into their new home on Maple Drive. The house was a modest 2-story, with a small garden Emily loved tending. She'd always dreamed of a place where she could grow roses and host barbecues, and John was happy to make that dream come true. But the Willow Creek HOA was a machine of bureaucracy, run by a small clique of self-appointed enforcers who seemed to thrive on control. Their leader, Margaret Hensley, was a wiry woman in her late 50s with a penchant for clipboard inspections and passive-aggressive notes. Her right-hand man, Carl Dutton, was a retired accountant who carried himself like he was still balancing the world's ledger. Together, they patrolled the neighborhood like it was their personal fiefdom, issuing citations for everything from unapproved mailbox colors to grass that was half an inch too tall. John and Emily's first run-in with the HOA came just 2 weeks after they moved in. Margaret had left a notice on their door, citing a violation for non-compliant garden decorations. Apparently, Emily's ceramic gnome, a gift from her late mother, was deemed inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. John laughed it off at first, thinking it was a joke. Emily, ever the peacemaker, removed the gnome and replaced it with a plain flower pot to avoid trouble. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the citations piled up. Their trash cans were visible from the street for an hour past pickup day. Violation. Their garage door was left open during a sunny afternoon. Violation. Emily planted tulips instead of the HOA-approved marigolds. Violation. Each notice came with a fine, and each fine chipped away at Emily's patience. John, who'd faced far worse than petty bureaucrats in his career, told her to let it go. "They're just power-hungry busybodies," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "We'll outlast them." But Emily wasn't one to back down forever. She started attending HOA meetings, politely questioning the rules, suggesting compromises. Margaret and Carl didn't take kindly to her suggestions. To them, Emily was a troublemaker, a new resident who didn't understand how things worked in Willow Creek. The tension simmered, but John stayed out of it. He'd promised himself he'd leave conflict behind when he left the SEALs. He spent his days fixing up the house, teaching self-defense classes at the local community center, and helping Emily with her garden. He was content, or at least he thought he was, until that Saturday morning when everything changed. It was just after 8 a.m. Emily had gone outside to water her roses, a routine she loved. John was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the news on his tablet, when he heard her scream. It wasn't a sound of surprise or annoyance. It was fear. John's training kicked in before his conscious mind could catch up. He was out the door in seconds, his bare feet hitting the grass as he scanned the front yard. Emily was on the ground, clutching her arm. Standing over her were Carl Dutton and a younger man John didn't recognize, both wearing the bright yellow vests that marked them as HOA compliance officers. Carl was holding a measuring tape, and the younger man had a clipboard. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered across the street, watching but not intervening. John's eyes locked onto Emily's face, pale, shaken, with tears welling up. "What the hell is going on?" John's voice was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of a man who'd given orders in life-or-death situations. Carl looked up, startled, but quickly regained his composure. "This is HOA business," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Your wife was non-compliant with landscaping regulations. She became aggressive when we attempted to measure her rose bushes." "Aggressive?" John's eyes narrowed as he knelt beside Emily. "You okay, Em?" She nodded, but her voice trembled. "They grabbed me, John. I was just watering the plants, and they yanked me back. I fell." John's jaw tightened. He helped Emily to her feet, his hands gentle but his mind racing. He turned to Carl and the other man, who was now shifting uncomfortably. "You put your hands on my wife." "We were enforcing community standards," Carl said, his tone defensive. "She refused to comply. We had no choice." "No choice." John stepped closer, his 6'2" frame towering over Carl's slight build. The younger man took a step back, but Carl held his ground, clutching his measuring tape like a shield. "You think you can manhandle my wife over some flowers?" "This isn't personal," Carl said, though his voice wavered. "The HOA has rules. If you don't like them, you can file a formal complaint." John's eyes flicked to the younger man, who was now looking at the ground. "What's your name?" John asked. The man hesitated. "Brian," he mumbled. "Brian Kessler." "You knew at this, Brian." John's tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that made Brian swallow hard. "He's a volunteer," Carl interjected. "He's learning the ropes. Learning to put hands on a woman." John's voice was still low, but the air around him seemed to thicken. The neighbors across the street were whispering now, their phones out, recording the scene. Emily tugged at John's arm. "Let's just go inside," she said softly. "It's not worth it." But John wasn't moving. He'd spent years learning to read situations, to assess threats, to know when to act and when to walk away. This wasn't about roses or rules anymore. This was about someone hurting his wife, and that was a line no one crossed. "Apologize to her," John said, his eyes locked on Carl. Carl scoffed. "I don't take orders from you. If you have a problem, take it up with Margaret." John's hand twitched, an old reflex from years of training. He could have disarmed Carl of his measuring tape and had him on the ground in seconds, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned to Brian. "You got anything to say?" Brian's face was red. I didn't mean for her to fall. It was an accident." "An accident," John repeated, his voice flat. "You grab someone's arm hard enough to make them fall. That's not an accident." "John, please," Emily said, her voice stronger now. "Let's go." John looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes, not of Carl or Brian, but of what John might do. That was enough to pull him back. He nodded, took her hand, and led her toward the house. But as they reached the porch, Carl called after them. "This isn't over, Miller. You'll be hearing from the board." John didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He'd already memorized every detail of the scene. Carl's smug expression, Brian's nervous fidgeting, the exact distance between them and the front door. If the HOA wanted to push this, they were about to learn who they were dealing with. Inside, Emily sat at the kitchen table, rubbing her arm. John filled a bag with ice and handed it to her. "Let me see," he said, his voice soft now. "It's just a bruise," she said, pulling up her sleeve. A red mark was forming where Carl had grabbed her, and John's stomach twisted. He'd seen worse injuries, inflicted worse himself, but this was different. This was Emily. "I should have been out there with you," he said, sitting across from her. "You can't be everywhere," she replied, managing a small smile. "I'm fine, really. They're just bullies." "Bullies don't get to touch you," John said, his voice hardening. "Not without consequences." Emily reached for his hand. "Don't do anything crazy, okay? I know you. I know how you get. John squeezed her hand but didn't respond. He was already running scenarios in his head, calculating risks, planning moves. The seal in him was awake, and it wasn't going back to sleep. The next day, a letter arrived from the HOA. It was typed on official letterhead, signed by Margaret Hensley herself. The letter accused Emily of obstructing HOA compliance efforts and demanded a $500 fine, plus a mandatory meeting with the board to discuss further disciplinary action. It also warned that failure to comply could result in a lien on their property. John read the letter twice, his face unreadable, then set it down on the table. They're escalating, he said to Emily, who was sipping tea and trying to pretend everything was normal. They're just trying to scare us, she said. We'll pay the fine and move on. No, John said, his voice quiet but firm. We're not paying anything. Emily looked at him, worry creeping into her eyes. John, we can't fight the whole HOA. They'll make our lives miserable. They already have, he said. And they're not stopping until someone stops them. Over the next week, John did what he did best. He gathered intelligence. He started attending HOA meetings, sitting in the back of the community center, silent but observant. He noted who spoke, who deferred to Margaret, who looked uncomfortable with her iron-fisted approach. He learned the HOA's structure, its bylaws, its weaknesses. He found out that Margaret and Carl had been running the board unopposed for years, using fines to fund their own projects, like a new gazebo that mysteriously ended up in Margaret's backyard. He also learned that Brian, the young volunteer, was Carl's nephew, roped into the HOA to pad their numbers. John didn't just observe, he acted. He started talking to neighbors, casually at first, asking about their experiences with the HOA. Stories poured out. Fines for minor infractions, threats of legal action, even harassment. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, told John how Carl had yelled at her for leaving her walker on her porch. Another, a single dad named Mike, said the HOA had threatened to foreclose on his home over unpaid fines he couldn't afford. The more John heard, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just a nuisance. It was a racket, preying on people too tired or scared to fight back. Emily noticed the change in John. He was quieter, more focused, like he'd been in the early days of their marriage when he'd come home from deployments. She didn't ask what he was planning, but she knew better than to try to stop him. Just promise me you won't hurt anyone, she said one night as they lay in bed. I won't, he said. Not unless I have to. The HOA's next move came 2 weeks after the incident in the yard. A process server showed up at their door with a summons to appear before the board. The charge: willful defiance of HOA authority. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center, and the letter warned that failure to attend could result in escalated measures. John spent the week preparing. He didn't tell Emily everything, but he assured her he had a plan. Trust me, he said, and she did. She always had. The community center was packed that Saturday. Word had spread about the confrontation in the miller's yard, and neighbors were curious to see what would happen. Margaret presided over the meeting like a judge, her clipboard replaced by a gavel she'd bought for the occasion. Carl sat to her right, Brian to her left, and the rest of the board, 3 other residents who rarely spoke, filled out the table. John and Emily sat in the front row, John's posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room like a predator. Margaret opened the meeting with a lecture about the importance of community standards. She read the charges against Emily, accusing her of disrupting the harmony of Willow Creek and physically obstructing compliance officers. She presented photos of the rose bushes, claiming they were overgrown and a blight on the neighborhood. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. When Margaret finished, she turned to Emily. Mrs. Miller, do you have anything to say in your defense? Emily started to speak, but John raised a hand. I'll take this, he said, standing. The room went quiet. John wasn't loud or theatrical, but there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. I'm not here to talk about roses, he said, his voice steady. I'm here to talk about what happened to my wife. 2 men, your compliance officers, put their hands on her. They caused her to fall. They bruised her arm. And now you're trying to fine us for it. Margaret's lips pursed. Mr. Miller, this is not about your wife's alleged injuries. This is about her refusal to comply with our rules. Alleged. John's voice didn't rise, but the word carried weight. He pulled out his phone and held up a photo of Emily's bruised arm, taken the day of the incident. This isn't alleged. This is evidence. The crowd stirred. Margaret banged her gavel. That's out of order, Mr. Miller. You will not disrupt this meeting. I'm not disrupting anything, John said. I'm stating facts. And here's another one. Your HOA is out of control. You've been fining people left and right, threatening their homes, their livelihoods. You think you can bully people because you've got a clipboard and a rulebook. But you made a mistake when you went after my wife. Carl leaned forward. Is that a threat, Miller? John's eyes locked onto Carl's. It's a promise. You touch my wife again, you deal with me. The room was silent now. Margaret's face was red, but she didn't bang her gavel. Brian looked like he wanted to disappear. John didn't.